The encounter on the road. The late afternoon sun burned over the long stretch of County Road 16, casting heat waves that shimmered like liquid glass over the asphalt. The hum of cicadas filled the silence, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind brushing past the barren wooden fences that lined the countryside. For most, this road was nothing more than a forgotten detour on the outskirts of upstate New York. A path only the poor and the overlooked ever bothered to take. For 14-year-old Amara Collins, however, it was the lifeline she walked every day from her school to the modest neighborhood she called home. Her figure was small, dressed in a wrinkled white uniform shirt that had seen too many wash cycles. Her backpack slung over one shoulder. The straps were frayed, the corners patched with careful stitching, but inside it rested something far more precious than books: a mechanic's toolkit, neatly wrapped in cloth, a gift from her Uncle Matthew, the only family she had left. Amara's steps were steady and unhurried. She was used to long walks, used to the gravel crunching under her shoes, used to the quiet of a world that rarely noticed her. With her dark skin, her natural curls tied back into a simple bun, and her uniform that carried the wrinkles of countless days, she didn't stand out in the crowd of students. She wasn't the popular girl with expensive sneakers or the one who raised her hand in class just to hear her own voice. She was quiet, disciplined, and often overlooked. Yet anyone who took the time to notice would see a sharpness in her eyes, the kind of focus that belonged to someone who saw deeper than most. Her uncle often told her, "Machines talk if you listen close enough. Same as people, same as life. Don't let the noise fool you, Amara, find the heartbeat." She had taken that to heart, learning to read the rhythm of an engine as easily as she read her school books. As she rounded a bend in the road, Amara slowed. Up ahead, by the side of the gravel shoulder, sat a gleaming black Mustang GT. Its hood popped open and faint wisps of smoke curling into the sky like whispers of distress. The sleek car looked foreign on this dusty road, like a predator trapped in a cage it didn't belong to. Standing beside it was a man in his mid-30s, dressed in a perfectly tailored Italian suit, his leather shoes gleaming even in the dust. He paced in tight circles, phone pressed to his ear, his expression tight with frustration. His voice carried easily in the quiet countryside. "I don't care what you have to reschedule. I'm stranded in the middle of nowhere and no mechanic is coming for 2 hours.
2 hours!
This is ridiculous." He shoved the phone into his pocket, muttered a curse under his breath, and glared at the engine as if his sheer willpower could coax it back to life. Amara lingered for a moment, watching. She could smell it before she even reached the car. That faint, syrupy sweetness of coolant leaking where it shouldn't. Her eyes traced the Mustang's sleek lines, lingering on the steam curling from under the hood, the faint drip beneath the front bumper. She knew instantly what the problem was. The radiator hose had cracked, causing coolant to bleed out and the engine to overheat. She could almost hear her uncle's voice guiding her. "Never walk past a broken engine if you know how to help, Amara. Knowing and doing nothing is worse than ignorance." She tightened her grip on the strap of her backpack, drew a breath, and stepped closer. "Sir," she called softly, her tone polite yet steady. "Your car's leaking coolant." The man straightened, startled, and turned toward her. His eyes swept over her from head to toe, taking in the faded school uniform, the worn sneakers, the modest backpack. A flicker of impatience crossed his face. "It's nothing. Just a minor issue. You should head home. It's late." Amara didn't flinch. "It's not nothing. If you keep trying to run it, you'll ruin the engine. I can help if you want." She spoke calmly, with a confidence that surprised even her. The man chuckled dryly, though there was no humor in it. "This is a Mustang GT, not some old farm truck. Trust me, kid, it's complicated. I'll wait for a real mechanic." Without arguing, Amara crouched by the car, setting her backpack down. She pulled out her toolkit with practiced hands, her eyes already fixed on the problem. Her uncle had drilled into her that respect didn't come from words, but from action. She tugged the small flashlight from her kit, clicked it on, and angled it toward the puddle forming beneath the car. "That's glycol," she said evenly. "See how it smells sweet? That means coolant. Your radiator hose is cracked. If you don't patch it up, you're not going anywhere, even if you wait for a tow." The man hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. For the first time, he crouched beside her, following her gaze. There, plain as day, was the steady drip, blue-green liquid staining the dirt. He inhaled sharply, catching the faintly acrid, sugary scent he had overlooked before. His brows knit together. How did you know that?" Amara shrugged lightly, already pulling out a small sealing kit and a roll of tape. I learned from my uncle. He runs the only garage in our town. He makes me carry this in case I ever need it. Her hands moved swiftly, deftly detaching the hose, wiping it down with a rag, and applying the sealant before binding it with strong layers of tape. Every movement was careful, efficient, not rushed, not hesitant. She worked like someone who had done this 100 times, though her youth suggested otherwise. The man found himself staring, his skepticism slowly unraveling. He had spent his life surrounded by experts, professionals, and people who bent over backwards to serve his money. Yet here was a 14-year-old schoolgirl with oil-stained hands and unwavering focus, patching up his $100,000 car without so much as asking who he was. For once, he felt no power in his wealth, no authority in his status. He was simply a stranded man watching someone far younger take control of the situation. When she finished, Amara stood and wiped her hands on a cloth, her eyes meeting his with quiet dignity. It's only temporary. You'll need a proper replacement hose, but this will get you to town. He studied her for a long moment before finally asking, "What's your name?" "Amara Collins," she replied. She didn't extend her hand at first, but when he offered his, she shook it firmly, her grip small but steady. And that was when he saw it. A glint of red caught the fading sunlight, burning like fire against her dark skin. On her finger was a ring, old and slightly oversized, its golden band bound with black thread to make it fit. At its center, a ruby, deep blood red, glowing faintly as the light struck it. His breath caught in his chest. His hand froze in hers. That ring. His mind reeled back 15 years to memories buried under years of luxury, skyscrapers, and carefully hidden lies. The twisting vine design, the way the ruby gleamed, it wasn't just familiar. It was unforgettable. It was impossible. Amara noticed the change in his expression, the sudden stiffness in his hand. She withdrew gently, her face calm but her eyes carrying a flicker of guarded sadness. "It was my mother's," she said softly, almost as if answering the question before he asked it. "She told me it was a symbol of a promise. She passed it on to me before she died last year." The man's chest tightened, his pulse hammered in his ears. He swallowed hard, his composure cracking for the first time that day. This wasn't chance. This wasn't some random schoolgirl with a toolkit and confidence. This was something else, something dangerous. That ring wasn't just jewelry. It was a key, a reminder, a wound he thought had been sealed by time and power, now reopened by the hand of a girl standing on a dusty road with dirt on her sneakers and light in her eyes. And for the first time in years, Christopher Reynolds, heir to the Reynolds real estate empire, a man feared in boardrooms across Manhattan, felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Shadows of the past. The hum of the patched Mustang's engine filled the silence as the two stood by the roadside, waiting for the heat to settle enough for the car to be driven again. The countryside stretched endlessly around them, painted in fading tones of orange and gold as the sun dipped lower into the horizon. Christopher Reynolds, the polished face of Manhattan real estate, a man who had commanded boardrooms and signed billion-dollar deals, now found himself staring at a ruby ring on the hand of a 14-year-old schoolgirl. His throat felt dry, his polished confidence cracking with every passing second. The heat of the evening air was nothing compared to the fire crawling through his chest. He had seen that ring before, not just in passing, not as some accessory from a stranger. He had held it in his hand once. He had pressed it into someone's palm with trembling fingers and a promise he never kept. And now, impossibly, it rested on Amara's hand, glinting with an accusation he could not escape. He turned away, running a hand across his jaw, his usually sharp composure reduced to silence. For the first time in years, his voice betrayed him when he spoke. "That ring. Where did your mother get it?" His tone was cautious, the words dragged out as if he feared the answer. Amara's gaze lowered to her finger, to the stone that burned crimson against her skin. The softness of her face hardened slightly, not in anger, but in the way a wound aches when touched. "She never said," she replied quietly, "only that it was given to her long ago and that it carried a promise. She told me to wear it proudly, to never take it off because one day I would understand what it meant. But she passed away before she could tell me more." Her voice carried a weight far older than her years, the kind of calm strength that is born only through loss. Chris felt his stomach twist. Sarah Collins. He had been only 20 when he met her, not in the glass towers of Manhattan, but in the forgotten halls of Sunshine Orphanage, a place his father had dragged him to during a so-called charity project. He had been the reluctant heir back then, restless, careless, too eager to impress and too weak to stand against his father's cruelty. Sarah had been different. A nurse with a kind smile, dark eyes that carried both sadness and hope, and hands that healed without judgment. She had been older than him, wiser, and yet she had listened to his restless dreams without laughing. She had seen him not as a rich man's son, but as a boy who hated the shadow of his own last name. On a day when guilt had gnawed at him for the broken promises his family had made to the children of that orphanage, he had slipped her that ring, whispering a promise he swore he would return to keep. A promise to protect her, to help her, to stand against the darkness of his own bloodline. But he never returned. He had let the pull of his father's empire consume him, burying that memory under skyscrapers and contracts, hiding the guilt beneath polished shoes and boardroom victories. And now the ring, that cursed reminder of his cowardice, sat on the finger of her daughter. Her daughter. The weight of it nearly buckled his knees. Amara, unaware of the storm raging inside him, packed her tools back into her bag with practiced care. Her movements were calm, deliberate, almost ritualistic, as though each placement of a wrench or roll of tape was a way to anchor herself against the chaos of the world. She wasn't looking at him for approval, wasn't waiting for thanks. She had done what she needed to do and was prepared to move on. That quiet independence unnerved Chris in ways he couldn't explain. People around him always waited for his acknowledgement, hungered for his recognition, but this girl did not. "You remind me of someone," he said suddenly, his voice lower now, stripped of arrogance. Amara glanced at him, her brow furrowing in question, but he shook his head quickly, retreating into silence. What could he say? That her mother once softened the heart of a cold heir, only to be abandoned when he chose power over humanity. That the empire she stood before was built not only on land and steel, but on broken promises and stolen futures. No, not yet. The truth was a blade, and she was too young, too innocent to bear its full edge. Still, the questions clawed at him. "Amara," he asked carefully, "your uncle. This Matthew you spoke of, did he ever mention your father?" Her eyes darkened, the flicker of pain unmistakable. "No," she replied simply. "My mother never spoke of him either. All I know is that he wasn't there. Uncle Matthew raised me after she passed." There was no bitterness in her tone, only the acceptance of someone who had long ago stopped expecting answers. Chris's breath caught. He wanted to ask more, to press, to demand the truth that lingered between them, but the words tangled in his throat. If her mother was Sarah, if the timing matched, then could it be? The thought both terrified and shattered him. He gripped the edge of the car door, grounding himself against the whirlwind of suspicion and guilt that threatened to consume him. The countryside grew quieter, the sun sinking lower, shadows stretching long across the road. Amara slung her backpack over her shoulder, ready to continue her walk home. "Your car should hold for now," she said softly, offering him a small, almost weary smile. "Drive slow. Don't push it too hard." Chris stared at her. 1,000 words fighting for release, none escaping. He wanted to stop her, to demand she stay, to unravel the truth immediately, but he knew instinctively that forcing it would only drive her away. So he simply nodded, watching as she turned and began walking down the gravel path, her figure small but unyielding against the vast horizon. For the first time in years, Christopher Reynolds felt powerless, not because of a deal gone wrong or a rival's betrayal, but because of a girl with nothing but a frayed backpack, a mechanic's toolkit, and a ruby ring that carried the weight of his sins. As the Mustang roared back to life under her temporary repair, Chris sat behind the wheel, his hands trembling against the leather. He had built an empire on control, on dominance, on silencing anything that threatened the Reynolds name. But how could he silence the past when it had returned wearing the face of a child who carried his broken promise on her hand? The road stretched out before him, long and uncertain, and for the first time Christopher Reynolds knew he wasn't driving toward another victory. He was driving straight into the storm he had tried to outrun his entire life. The millionaire's double life, though. Night had already wrapped Manhattan in its restless glow by the time Christopher Reynolds returned to his world of marble lobbies and glass towers. The Mustang, patched and limping but functional thanks to Amara's quick hands, had carried him out of the dusty countryside and back into the concrete kingdom that bore his name. The transition from silence to chaos was jarring. Neon lights blinked along Fifth Avenue. The endless stream of honking taxis fought against sleek black limousines, and the cold metallic hum of skyscrapers loomed like titans swallowing the stars. For the rest of the city, it was a spectacle of wealth and opportunity. For Chris, it was a cage, every wall lined with the shadows of choices he had made. His penthouse apartment sat above it all, perched like a crown on the tallest of his family's developments, its walls lined with imported Italian marble and glass so clear it seemed the skyline itself bent to bow before him. But the silence inside was unbearable. Chris walked into the living room, loosened his tie, and poured himself a drink he didn't taste. His reflection in the vast floor-to-ceiling windows mocked him. A man of power dressed in wealth yet shaken to his core by a girl with worn sneakers and a ruby ring. He leaned against the glass, the weight of memory pressing harder than the city's glow. The Reynolds name was not just a brand, it was a dynasty, one cemented by manipulation and ruthless ambition. His father, William Reynolds, had been a legend in the real estate world, carving entire blocks of the city into monuments to his greed. Chris had inherited the empire, but also the rot that lived inside it. He had played his role to perfection: sharp suits, decisive deals, the ruthless negotiator who bent others' wills with contracts and iron handshakes. But in the quiet moments when no one was watching, the cracks showed. He remembered the orphanage his father shut down to build a luxury hotel. He remembered Sarah Collins, the nurse who begged them to spare the children, who held his gaze as if she saw through his polished facade. He remembered slipping the ruby ring into her palm, whispering a promise he could not keep, and he remembered walking away, telling himself he had no choice. Now her daughter wore that same ring, her very existence like a mirror reflecting the man he could have been and the man he chose to become instead. It was unbearable. Chris ran a hand through his hair, downed the rest of his drink, and tried to bury the thought as he had buried so many before. But the ring, the girl, her steady eyes, they refused to be buried. As the city lights blurred past, Chris realized something he hadn't allowed himself to admit in years. He was afraid. Not of losing deals, not of financial ruin, but of facing the truth. The ruby ring on Amara's finger was not just a relic of a forgotten promise. It was evidence of who he really was, and who he had failed to be. And the girl herself, whether she knew it or not, was becoming a storm he could no longer ignore. In the days that followed, Chris began digging quietly, pulling at the threads of Amara Collins' life with the same precision he used to dismantle his rivals. His private investigators brought him details: a small house on the outskirts of town, Uncle Matthew's modest garage, Amara's reputation as a quiet but gifted student. Nothing in her life suggested privilege, wealth, or connections. She lived in simplicity, her world revolving around school, her uncle, and the occasional repair job she helped with. And yet the deeper he dug, the heavier his guilt grew. She was everything he wasn't: grounded, resilient, untainted by greed. And she was Sarah's daughter. Chris found himself staring at her photograph one evening, the first his investigators had provided. Amara was walking home, her backpack slung across one shoulder, her face serious but calm. There was nothing extraordinary in the image, nothing glamorous, and yet it pierced him. For in her eyes he saw Sarah again, and in her hand, faint but unmistakable, the red glow of the ring. The empire he had spent years fortifying with steel, glass, and contracts suddenly felt fragile, because it wasn't built on strength. It was built on silence, on forgetting, on betraying those who trusted him. And now silence was no longer possible. Amara Collins, whether knowingly or not, had reopened the past. Chris leaned back in his chair, staring at the Manhattan skyline outside his window. His reflection stared back: tailored suit, expensive watch, polished hair, the image of success. But beneath it all, he saw a man cornered not by rivals, but by truth. He realized then that no deal, no skyscraper, no empire would ever silence the memory of Sarah Collins, nor the eyes of her daughter who now walked the earth with the promise he had broken wrapped around her finger. And in that realization came a chilling certainty. Amara was no longer just a girl who had fixed his car. She was the spark of a storm that could consume him, and perhaps destroy the Reynolds empire forever. The storm breaks. The weeks that followed blurred into a haze of meetings, contracts, and signatures. Yet Christopher Reynolds carried a weight that no skyscraper or polished deal could lift. He had built his empire on speed, moving quickly, making ruthless decisions, outpacing rivals with calculated ambition. But now, for the first time in his career, he hesitated. He hesitated not because of a failing project or an economic downturn, but because of a girl with oil-stained fingers and a ruby ring that haunted his every waking moment. In the boardroom, he still commanded respect. His voice carried authority, his eyes cut like steel, and his signature sealed billion-dollar expansions. But inside, a fracture widened. Each new contract signed feeling less like triumph and more like betrayal of a promise he had once made long ago in the shadows of an orphanage his family destroyed. One evening, after another round of aggressive negotiations, Chris found himself driving once again, not to the penthouse or the elite clubs where his peers toasted champagne to their victories, but to the outskirts of town where the neon lights faded and the polished roads turned to gravel. He slowed the Mustang near a modest garage lit by a single flickering bulb. Inside, he could see a man bent over an old pickup truck, wiping his hands on a rag, his clothes stained permanently with grease. And beside him, a familiar figure, Amara, her curls tied back neatly, her uniform shirt now faded from too many washes, carefully holding a wrench while her uncle guided her hand. Chris sat in the car longer than he intended, watching them through the windshield. The sight twisted something inside him. Here was a man of little means teaching a girl with patience and kindness, shaping her confidence through skill, not wealth. Uncle Matthew didn't tower over her with expectations. He nurtured her resilience. And Amara, she absorbed it all like sunlight, her sharp eyes focused, her movements deliberate. She had none of the arrogance he saw daily in Manhattan's wealthy youth. None of the entitlement of children who had everything handed to them. Instead, she had grit, discipline, and a kind of dignity that money couldn't manufacture. For a moment, Chris considered leaving, driving off before either of them noticed. But before he could act, Amara glanced up, her gaze catching his across the dimly lit street. She didn't look surprised. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she simply studied him, her expression calm but questioning, as if she knew he wasn't just another customer passing by. Chris killed the engine, stepped out, and walked toward the garage. Uncle Matthew straightened, wary but polite. "Evening. You lost?" His tone carried the firm caution of a man used to protecting what little he had. Chris shook his head, his polished shoes crunching against gravel. "No, I just wanted to thank your niece again. She saved me on the road a few weeks ago. I thought it was time I said it properly." Matthew raised a brow, his skepticism clear, but Amara spoke before he could. "You didn't need to come all the way here for that," she said, wiping her hands on a cloth. Her voice wasn't cold, but it wasn't deferential either. It was steady, a quiet reminder that she hadn't helped him for recognition. Chris exhaled, searching for words, but the sight of the ruby ring glinting under the garage light pulled them from him. "That ring," he said softly, his tone slipping into something more vulnerable. "It belonged to your mother, didn't it?" The change in the atmosphere was instant. Matthew stiffened, his protective instincts flaring as he stepped subtly between Chris and Amara. "What business do you have asking about her mother?" His voice carried the edge of warning, but beneath it lay grief, old and raw. Chris swallowed, his throat tight. "Because I knew her," he admitted, the confession tasting both bitter and liberating. "Years ago, at Sunshine Orphanage." The words spilled before he could stop them, the dam of silence cracking. Matthew froze. Amara's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. The name of the orphanage hung in the air like a ghost no one wanted to summon. Sunshine. The place that had been bulldozed into the ground by the Reynolds empire. The place whispered about in town as a graveyard of promises and broken lives. "I was there," Chris continued, his voice low, steadying itself even as guilt gnawed at him. "Your mother, Sarah Collins. She was the nurse who worked there. She fought for those children, fought harder than anyone. His voice faltered, memory stabbing too sharply. "She was the kindest soul I ever met." Amara's lips parted, her fingers brushing the ruby ring unconsciously. "You knew my mother?" she whispered, her voice trembling between hope and disbelief. Chris nodded, the weight of truth pressing down on his shoulders. "Yes, and I failed her. The garage fell silent, the hum of the nearby street lamp the only sound. Matthew's eyes narrowed, suspicion hardening into anger. "You're Reynolds," he said sharply, recognition dawning. "The son of William Reynolds. The ones who crushed that orphanage, who took everything from this town. You." His voice cracked under the force of rage held back for too long. "You dare come here pretending gratitude when your family destroyed lives?" Chris didn't argue. He didn't defend himself, though every instinct as a businessman told him to. Instead, he bowed his head slightly, shame burning hotter than anger. "You're right. My father destroyed it. I became part of that empire. But I can't run from it anymore. Not after seeing Amara." The mention of her name pulled the air tighter. Amara stood silently, her young face torn between suspicion and an ache she couldn't name. For years, her mother had been a mystery cloaked in silence, her father an absence too large to fill. Now standing before her was a man who claimed to have known Sarah, who spoke her name with reverence, who looked at the ruby ring as if it carried his own sins. "What promise did you make her?" Amara asked finally, her voice quiet but piercing. Chris's chest tightened. He met her gaze, the weight of years crashing into the moment. "That I would come back. That I would fight for her. That she wouldn't be alone. And I broke that promise. I walked away. I became the very thing she despised." His voice cracked, the confession ripping out of him. The silence that followed was unbearable. Matthew turned away, jaw clenched, his eyes burning with old grief. Amara looked down at the ring, her thumb running across the smooth ruby surface, the words of her mother echoing faintly in her memory. "Wear it proudly. One day you'll understand." Now she did. The ring was not just a gift. It was a symbol of betrayal, of a promise broken by the man standing before her. Chris drew a shaky breath. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I can't let the past keep festering in silence. If there's any way, if there's anything I can do to make this right." Matthew cut him off sharply. "Make it right? You can't undo what your family did. You can't bring back the lives destroyed. You can't give Sarah back her years of struggle. Don't you dare stand here and talk about making it right." Chris absorbed the words, each one cutting deeper, yet he didn't retreat. For once in his life, he didn't reach for power to shield himself. He let the weight of blame settle where it belonged. But it was Amara's voice, soft but steady, that broke the tension. "Maybe you can't undo the past," she said, her eyes lifting to meet his. "But maybe you can stop pretending it never happened." The words struck him harder than any accusation, because they were true. Pretending had been his entire life. Burying, building over, silencing, polishing. But here, in the modest glow of a flickering garage light, a girl barely 14 had spoken a truth he had never been brave enough to face. And in that moment, Christopher Reynolds knew that the storm had truly broken, because the past was no longer buried. It was alive, breathing through Amara Collins, and it demanded reckoning. The empire falls, the legacy rises. The days after Christopher's confession carried a weight unlike anything he had ever known. He had stood in countless boardrooms, outnumbered by rivals and critics, yet always emerged the victor. He had stared down government officials, ruthless competitors, and the gnawing greed of his own investors. But nothing had unsettled him like the silence that followed Amara's words in that dim garage. "Stop pretending it never happened." Those words echoed in his mind each night as he tried to sleep in his glass-walled penthouse, each morning as he faced his reflection in the mirror, and each moment he stepped into the gilded prison of his office. The ring, the girl, the orphanage. They had torn open a wound he could no longer ignore. For years, the Reynolds empire had been untouchable. The family's name commanded fear and respect in equal measure, its fortune woven into the very steel and concrete of Manhattan. But empires, Chris knew now, were not destroyed from without. They crumbled from within. His father had believed in power through silence, in burying the cries of the weak beneath towering hotels and commercial towers. Chris had inherited that same silence, even as it poisoned him. And now Amara Collins, a schoolgirl with nothing but dignity and resilience, had become the living embodiment of the truth his empire could not contain. The reckoning began quietly, almost imperceptibly. A news outlet received leaked documents, financial records tied to the Sunshine Orphanage demolition, detailing payouts, falsified permits, and the silencing of employees. Chris recognized the handwriting in the signatures, his father's and his own, from years when he had blindly signed papers shoved before him without reading the fine print. The press devoured the scandal, dragging the Reynolds name into headlines filled with words like corruption, cover-up, and betrayal. Soon survivors of the orphanage came forward, men and women now grown, their lives scarred by displacement and loss. Their testimonies spread like wildfire, the cracks in the Reynolds empire widening by the hour. Chris stood before his board of directors in the glass tower one morning as they demanded explanations. Their voices, usually filled with reverence and calculation, now bristled with anger and fear. "We are bleeding investors," one snapped. "The Reynolds name is poison in the press," another hissed. "If you don't distance yourself, the empire falls with you." They wanted him to deny, to deflect, to bury the truth as his father had done. But Chris no longer could. He rose from his chair, his voice heavy but resolute. "The truth is already out, and it should be. My father destroyed lives for profit, and I let him. I will not silence it anymore." The boardroom erupted in fury, investors storming out, allies turning into enemies. Yet for the first time in his life, Chris felt strangely free. Meanwhile, in the small town where Amara lived, the story ignited a different fire. Neighbors who had once dismissed her as quiet and unremarkable now looked at her with awe. She was no longer just the girl walking home with a frayed backpack and grease on her hands. She was the girl whose mother had stood against giants, the girl who unknowingly carried the evidence of corruption on her finger, the girl who had faced down the most powerful man in New York without fear. Amara herself, though, did not bask in attention. She still rose early for school, still helped Uncle Matthew at the garage, still tied her curls neatly before class. But beneath her calm exterior, she felt the shift. She carried her mother's legacy not as a burden, but as a torch. Chris returned to see her once more, not in a sleek car or tailored suit, but stripped of pretense. His tie was gone, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his eyes tired but determined. He stood outside the garage as Amara worked, her small hands steady as she adjusted a carburetor. When she finally looked up, he spoke with no arrogance, no shield of power. "I wanted you to know," he began, his voice unsteady, "that I've told the truth. To the board, to the press, to anyone who would listen. They will come for me. Lawsuits, investigations, ruin. But I couldn't let it stay buried anymore." Amara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then quietly she said, "My mother always believed promises mattered. You broke one once, but maybe you've kept one now." Her words carried no triumph, only a solemn acknowledgement of change. Chris lowered his gaze, emotion tightening his chest. "She deserved better. You deserve better. I can't give back what was stolen, but I can fight now for what remains." It wasn't redemption, not fully, but it was the first step on a road he should have walked years ago. As weeks passed, the Reynolds empire collapsed in pieces. Lawsuits drained the company's coffers, investors fled, and the name once etched in gold across Manhattan's skyline became a symbol of greed unmasked. But amid the ruin, something else emerged. A foundation was created, not by the board, not by the remaining executives, but by Chris himself with Amara's quiet insistence. It was dedicated to the children displaced by sunshine, to education and opportunity for those whom the empire had once trampled. The first grant went to Amara's school, funding scholarships and a new science and engineering lab. The day the ribbon was cut, Amara stood at the edge of the crowd, her backpack still slung across one shoulder, her curls tied back neatly, the ruby ring glinting faintly in the sunlight. She wasn't on stage, she wasn't in the spotlight, but she didn't need to be. For Chris knew, and the community knew, that she was the spark that had brought the empire to its knees and replaced it with something far greater. In the quiet afterward, Chris approached her once more, his voice softer than it had ever been. "You changed everything," he admitted. Amara shook her head. "No, the truth changed everything. I just didn't look away from it." Her eyes lifted, bright and unwavering. "That's what my mother would have wanted." And with that, she walked away, her steps steady, her presence small against the vast world but larger than any empire ever built. The late afternoon sun bathed the street in gold, and for the first time in years, Chris felt not the weight of guilt, but the quiet, humbling light of hope. The empire of lies had fallen, but from its ashes rose something far stronger. The legacy of a promise reborn, carried not by wealth or power, but by the courage of a schoolgirl who refused to be invisible.